Nobody really notices the security guard at a fancy concert hall. They check your ticket, maybe tell you where the bathroom is, and that's about it. For David, that was exactly how he wanted it. At 54 years old, he'd become very good at being invisible. Every evening at 6 o'clock sharp, David would put on his navy blue uniform, clip on his name badge, and take his position at the main entrance of the Wellington Concert Hall. The building was stunning, all marble floors, crystal chandeliers and red velvet seats. Rich people came here to watch world-class musicians perform. David just made sure nobody walked in without a ticket. 3 years he'd been doing this job. 3 years of standing by doors, walking empty hallways at night and watching from the back as talented pianists and violinists made audiences cry with their music. Most of the other staff knew nothing about him. Where did he live? What did he do before this? Did he have family? Nobody asked, and David never told. The truth was, he liked the quiet. He liked being around music without being part of it. After his shift ended at 2 in the morning, when the building was completely empty, David would take his time walking through the auditorium. Sometimes he'd sit in one of those velvet seats and just look at the stage. The grand piano would still be there, lid closed, waiting for the next performance. He never touched it, never even thought about it. Well, that's not completely true. He thought about it. He just never let those thoughts turn into action. The director of the concert hall was a man named Richard, and he was everything David wasn't. Loud, confident, always wearing expensive suits that probably cost more than David made in a month. Richard had opinions about everything and made sure everyone heard them, especially his opinions about the staff. "You know what I love about this place?" Richard would say to his fancy friends, not caring who else heard. "Everything runs like clockwork, and if one clock breaks, you just replace it. Simple." David had heard him say stuff like that before. The cleaning crew, the ticket people, the security guards, to Richard they were all just replaceable parts. It didn't bother David much. He'd learned a long time ago that some people see you and some people don't. Richard definitely didn't. But then came that Tuesday evening in March. David was standing near the lobby, watching the crowd mingle before a show. Richard was there too, entertaining some wealthy donors who were considering giving money to the concert hall. They were drinking champagne and laughing about something. One of the donors, an older woman wearing more jewelry than seemed practical, pointed toward a doorway. "Is that a piano I see in there? In what looks like a break room?" Richard glanced over and chuckled. "Oh, that old thing. Yeah, somebody donated it years ago. It's where the staff take their lunch breaks. Hasn't been tuned in forever. Do any of your staff play?" Another donor asked. Richard threw back his head and laughed. Really laughed. Like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. God, I hope not. Can you imagine? One of the security guards sitting down thinking they're some kind of artist. He lowered his voice in a mock-serious tone. "Let me tell you, if I ever catch one of them playing that piano, I'll fire them on the spot. This is a professional establishment, not a place for amateurs to embarrass themselves." The donors laughed along with him. David was standing maybe 10 feet away, close enough to hear every word. His face didn't change. He kept that neutral expression he'd perfected over the years. But his hands hanging at his sides started to tremble slightly. He quickly clasped them behind his back. Richard never even glanced in his direction. To him, David wasn't really there. The thing about that piano in the break room, David had walked past it hundreds of times. It sat in the corner, covered with a thin sheet, surrounded by vending machines and a microwave that only worked half the time. Nobody paid attention to it. Sometimes during lunch breaks, people would put their food on top of it like it was just another table. David had looked at it, though, more than once. Late at night, when he was doing his rounds and the building was empty, he'd stop in that break room doorway. Just stop and look. His fingers would start moving at his sides like they had a memory of their own. Then he'd shake his head and keep walking. There was a reason he never played. A reason he'd spent the last 20 years avoiding pianos, avoiding music, avoiding everything that used to be his entire life. But nobody here knew about that. Nobody knew anything about David from before the uniform. After Richard's comment, something shifted. For the rest of that evening, David felt heavier. His rounds took longer. He kept thinking about that stupid piano, about Richard's cruel laugh, about being invisible. By midnight, when the last staff members had gone home and he was alone in the building, he found himself standing outside the break room again. The door was open. The piano was right there. His hand reached for the light switch, then pulled back. What was he thinking? Richard had made it clear. Play that piano and lose your job. Not that David wanted to play. He didn't. That part of his life was over. Buried. Done with. He turned and continued his rounds, checking doors, making sure windows were locked. But his mind kept drifting back. To the piano. To Richard's laugh. To a life he used to have before everything fell apart. The Wellington Concert Hall had a particular kind of silence at night. Not complete silence, old buildings never really go quiet. The heating system hummed. Floorboards creaked. The chandeliers made tiny tinkling sounds when air moved through the ventilation. But it was peaceful. Nobody making demands. Nobody looking at him with expectations. Just David and the ghosts of all the music that had been played here. He'd been drawn to this job for exactly that reason. Not the pay, security guards don't make much. Not the prestige, there wasn't any. But being around music without having to create it, that felt safe. He could appreciate it from a distance, like visiting a museum of his own past. Some nights he'd stand at the back of the auditorium during performances, hidden in the shadows where ushers normally stood. He'd watch the pianist's hands flying across the keys, hear the emotion pouring from the instrument, see the audience mesmerized, and he'd feel this strange mixture of longing and relief, longing for what he'd lost, relief that it wasn't his responsibility anymore. That night after Richard's comment, David finished his rounds and sat in the security office writing his log. All clear. No incidents. Same thing he wrote every night. Outside the window, the city was dark except for streetlights and the occasional passing car. In a few hours, dawn would come. His shift would end. He'd go back to his small apartment, maybe sleep, maybe just stare at the ceiling, thinking about things he tried not to think about. He looked at his hands, really looked at them. 54 years old, calloused from years of different jobs, construction, warehouse work, security. These hands had once done something extraordinary. Now they just opened doors and checked locks. David shook his head, dismissing the thought. Some chapters close and they don't reopen. That's just how life works. The piano in the break room would stay covered. Richard would keep being Richard. And David would keep being invisible. That's what he told himself anyway. But something about that night felt different. Like a door had cracked open somewhere in his chest, letting in just a little bit of light. He didn't like it. Light meant hope, and hope was dangerous. He had 3 more hours before his shift ended. 3 more hours of walking these halls, being nobody, wanting nothing. That was enough. That had to be enough. 22 years ago, David was a completely different person. He wasn't standing by doors or checking tickets. He was on stage under bright lights playing piano for thousands of people. His name was in newspapers. Critics wrote reviews calling him gifted, extraordinary, a once-in-a-generation talent. It started when he was just 7 years old. His mother was a piano teacher, and she'd leave him in her studio while she gave lessons. One day, while she was helping another student, David climbed onto the bench and started playing the same piece he'd just heard. Note for note. Perfect. His mother stood there with her mouth open, unable to believe what she was hearing. By age 12, David was performing in major concert halls. By his 20s, he was touring internationally. Tokyo, London, Paris, New York, he played everywhere. Recording companies wanted to work with him. Other musicians respected him. The piano wasn't just something he did. It was who he was. Then he met Lisa. She worked at a music magazine, came to interview him after a performance in Chicago. She knew nothing about classical music, admitted she'd never been to a concert like that before. She asked questions nobody else asked, not about his technique or his training, but about why he played, what the music felt like to him. They talked for 3 hours. 2 months later, she moved to be with him. Lisa became his anchor. Touring was lonely, exhausting, full of pressure to be perfect every single time. But she was there. She'd sit in the audience during his performances, and he'd find her face in the crowd. That's all he needed. Just knowing she was there made everything easier. They got married in a small ceremony. Nothing fancy, despite the money David was making. Just close friends and family. Lisa wore a simple white dress. David played a piece he'd written for her, the only original composition he'd ever created. It was the happiest day of his life. For 5 years, everything was good. Better than good. David's career kept growing. He was recording albums, winning awards, getting invited to perform with the world's best orchestras. And Lisa was beside him through all of it, managing his chaotic schedule, reminding him to eat and sleep, making their small apartment feel like home no matter which city they were in. Then came the doctor's appointment that changed everything. Lisa had been feeling tired for months. She kept saying it was just stress, that she'd be fine. David convinced her to get checked out. They were supposed to go to dinner after. He'd made reservations at her favorite restaurant instead. They sat in a small office while a doctor explained words like stage 4 and aggressive and limited options. Lisa squeezed David's hand so hard it hurt. He couldn't feel it. He couldn't feel anything except this rising panic, this sense that the floor was disappearing beneath him. The doctor kept talking about treatments, percentages, time frames. David heard maybe half of it. All he could think was that this wasn't possible. Lisa was 31 years old. They were supposed to have decades together. This couldn't be happening, but it was happening. The next 2 years became a blur of hospitals, treatments, hope, and disappointment. David canceled tours. His agent kept calling, saying he'd lose momentum, lose opportunities. David didn't care. Every morning he woke up next to Lisa was worth more than any stage, any applause, any review. The medical bills were crushing. Even with insurance, the costs never stopped. Experimental treatments, specialists, medications. David spent everything he'd saved. Then he started selling things. His awards, his piano, furniture, anything valuable. His agent stopped calling. Offers dried up. Other pianists, younger ones, took the opportunities that would have been his. He practiced when he could, but his hands weren't the same. The precision, the fluidity, it all started slipping away. You can't maintain that level of skill when you're sleeping in hospital chairs and your mind is somewhere else entirely. Music requires complete focus, and David's focus was on Lisa. Only Lisa. She fought hard. Harder than anyone should have to fight. There were good days when she'd smile and they'd watch old movies together. There were bad days when the pain was so intense she couldn't speak. David held her hand through all of it. He talked to her about the future like there would be one. He made plans they both knew they'd never keep. On a Tuesday morning in April, with sunlight coming through the hospital window, Lisa died. David was holding her hand. She'd been unconscious for 2 days. The doctor said she couldn't hear him anymore, but he'd kept talking anyway. Telling her about the life they'd had, the music they'd heard, the love that had filled every moment. When the monitors went flat, when the nurses came in, when the chaplain showed up with kind words and tissues, David just sat there empty. They had to ask him 3 times to leave the room. He didn't know where to go. Home wasn't home without her. Something broke in David that day. Not just his heart. Everyone's heart breaks when they lose someone. It was deeper than that. The part of him that made music, that found joy in it, that connected to audiences through the piano, it died with Lisa. He couldn't separate the two. Every melody reminded him of her. Every performance they'd shared. Every quiet evening when he'd played just for her while she read a book. He tried at first. A friend got him a small gig about 6 months after Lisa died. Just a local venue, nothing major. David sat at the piano, put his hands on the keys, and nothing came out. Not because he couldn't remember the notes, because the music felt dead inside him. Mechanical. Meaningless. He stood up and left. Didn't explain, didn't apologize. Just walked out and never looked back. The next decade was just survival. David moved from city to city, taking whatever jobs he could find. Construction work, warehouse shifts, night security. He avoided anything connected to music. Didn't listen to the radio. Didn't go anywhere near concert halls. It hurt too much. People who'd known him before, musicians, critics, fans, they forgot. That's what happens when you disappear from the spotlight. Someone else takes your place, and it's like you never existed. David preferred it that way. Being forgotten meant being free from expectations. But he couldn't stay away completely. That's the thing about music when it's been your whole life, it stays in your blood. After years of avoiding it, David started gravitating back. Not to perform. Never to perform. Just to be near it. That's how he ended up at the Wellington Concert Hall. When he saw the job posting for night security, something clicked. He could be around music without having to create it. He could hear it from a distance, appreciate it without the pressure, without the pain of trying to make it himself. For 3 years, it worked. He showed up, did his job, listened from the shadows, went home. The piano in the break room existed in his peripheral vision. He was aware of it the same way you're aware of an old photograph in a drawer, something you don't look at because looking at it brings back too much. Richard's comment shouldn't have affected him. It was just a stupid joke from a man who knew nothing about music, nothing about sacrifice, nothing about loss, but it did affect him, because it reminded David of something he'd been trying to forget. He had been extraordinary once. He had moved people with his music. He had possessed a gift that most people would never understand. And he'd walked away from it. Not because he wanted to, but because continuing without Lisa felt impossible. Late that night, after Richard's cruel laugh still echoed in his mind, David stood outside the break room again. The piano was right there behind that door. He could walk in. He could lift the cover. He could put his hands on the keys. But what would come out? After 22 years of silence, after all the grief and loss and deliberate forgetting, what would his hands remember? Would the music still be there? Or would it be as dead as he felt inside? David turned away. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Some chapters don't get second endings. He'd convinced himself of that. He had to believe it. Because the alternative, that he'd wasted 22 years hiding from the only thing he'd ever truly loved, was too painful to consider. He finished his shift, wrote his log, and went home as the sun came up. But something had shifted. Richard's words had planted a seed, a tiny crack in the wall David had built around his past. He didn't want it there. He tried to ignore it, but cracks have a way of growing whether you want them to or not. 3 weeks after Richard's joke, the Wellington Concert Hall was in complete chaos. David noticed it the moment he arrived for his evening shift. Staff members were practically running through the hallways. Phones were ringing nonstop. Richard's office door was closed, but you could hear him shouting from outside. David caught one of the ushers in the lobby. "What's going on?" "You haven't heard? Victor collapsed during rehearsal yesterday. Stroke, they rushed him to the hospital." The usher looked genuinely distressed. "The gala is in 3 weeks." 3 weeks, and we have no pianist." Victor was the star of the annual gala, the event that brought in the biggest donors, the most important guests. People had paid thousands of dollars per ticket specifically to hear him play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. It was the highlight of the concert hall's entire year. "Can't they find someone else?" David asked. The usher laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Every world-class pianist is already booked months in advance. Richard's been on the phone all day. Nobody's available. The board is talking about canceling the whole thing." David felt a strange sensation in his chest. He knew what canceling meant. Embarrassment for the concert hall. Financial disaster. Probably the end of Richard's career. But more than that, disappointment for everyone who'd been looking forward to hearing that particular piece of music. Rachmaninoff's Second Concerto wasn't just any piece. It was powerful, emotional, one of the most beautiful things ever written for piano. He pushed the thought away and went to his post. Not his problem. He was just the security guard. But over the next 2 weeks, the chaos only got worse. They brought in a pianist from Seattle, competent but not spectacular. After one rehearsal, the board rejected him. Too stiff, they said. No emotion. Then they tried a younger performer from New York. Better technically, but he didn't have the experience for such a major event. The board was panicking. Richard looked like he'd aged 5 years in 2 weeks. His expensive suits seemed to hang on him differently. David would see him late at night, long after everyone else had gone home, sitting in his office with his head in his hands. David's shifts became quieter. Most of the staff was being sent home early. No point keeping everyone around during the crisis. That meant more time alone in the building, more time walking past that break room, more time thinking about things he didn't want to think about. It was a Thursday night, almost 2 in the morning. David was doing his final rounds before dawn. The building felt heavier than usual, like it was holding its breath. In a few weeks, this place would either host a triumph or a disaster. Everything hung in the balance. He found himself standing outside the break room again. This was becoming a habit, and he didn't like it. But his feet had carried him here almost without thinking. Through the doorway, he could see the piano, still covered with its thin sheet. Nobody had touched it in weeks. Why would they? Everyone was too busy scrambling to save the gala. David's hands were trembling. He looked down at them, these 54-year-old hands that had once done something extraordinary. 22 years since they'd played seriously. 22 years of silence. Could they even remember? Before he could talk himself out of it, he walked into the room. He pulled the sheet off the piano, dust floating in the air. The instrument was old, probably hadn't been tuned in years. Dark wood, ivory keys yellowed with age. It wasn't anything like the concert grands he used to play, but it was a piano. David sat down on the bench. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. This was a mistake. He should leave. Richard had made it clear what would happen if he played. And besides, what if nothing came out? What if 22 years had erased everything? He placed his hands on the keys. They felt familiar and foreign at the same time. Like coming home to a house you used to live in, finding everything slightly different than you remembered. The first notes were tentative, shaky. His fingers stumbled over each other. But then something happened. Muscle memory kicked in. His hands remembered what his mind had tried to forget. The notes started flowing smoother, more confident. He played Chopin, a nocturne, one of the first pieces he'd ever mastered as a teenager. The melody filled the empty break room, spilling out into the hallway. It was rough at first, imperfect. But underneath the rust, underneath the years of neglect, the gift was still there. David closed his eyes. And suddenly he wasn't in a break room anymore. He was 25 again, playing for Lisa in their tiny apartment. She was sitting on the couch with her feet tucked under her, that smile on her face, the one that made everything make sense. Tears started rolling down his cheeks, but he kept playing. The grief that had lived inside him for 22 years poured out through his fingers. Every lost moment, every dream that died with Lisa, every silent year, it all became music. Beautiful, aching, honest music. He moved from Chopin to Debussy. Then, without planning to, he began Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The same piece Victor was supposed to perform. The same piece the concert hall desperately needed someone to play. His hands knew it perfectly. Every note, every dynamic, every subtle shift in emotion. This piece was about struggle and redemption, about finding beauty after loss. David had lived that story. He understood it in his bones. He was so lost in the music that he didn't hear the door open wider. Didn't notice someone standing in the hallway, frozen in complete shock. It wasn't until he finished, his hands resting on the keys, his face wet with tears, that he opened his eyes and saw Richard standing there. The director's expression was something David had never seen before. His mouth was literally hanging open. His eyes were wide. He looked like someone who'd just witnessed something impossible. The silence between them stretched out. David could hear his own breathing, could feel his heart still racing. This was it. He'd broken the rule. Richard had been clear. Playing the piano meant losing his job. David stood up slowly, wiping his face with his sleeve. "I apologize, sir. I know what you said. I'll clear out my locker." But Richard didn't move. He just stood there, staring at David like he was seeing him for the first time. When he finally spoke, his voice came out strange, almost a whisper. "Who are you?" The question hung in the air. David could have lied, could have deflected. But 22 years of hiding suddenly felt like too much weight to carry. The truth came out in a rush. He told Richard everything. About his career, about performing in the world's greatest concert halls, about Lisa and her illness, about losing everything and walking away. He explained why he'd taken this job, why he'd been hiding, why he'd spent 2 decades being invisible. Richard listened without interrupting. His expression shifted from shock to something that looked almost like awe. When David finished talking, the director pulled out his phone. "Play it again," Richard said. His hands were shaking as he held up the phone. The Rachmaninoff. "Play it again, all of it." "Sir, I don't think—" "Play it, please." So David sat back down and played. This time Richard recorded every note. When he finished, the director was already dialing, not even caring that it was 3 a.m. "I found him," Richard said into the phone, his voice cracking with excitement. "I found our pianist. What happened next felt like a dream." Within hours, board members arrived at the concert hall. David played for them in that dingy break room on that out-of-tune piano, while they sat on folding chairs in their pajamas. Nobody said a word until he finished. Then they all started talking at once. They wanted to verify his story. Someone pulled up old articles on their phone. There was David, 22 years younger at the height of his career. Reviews calling him brilliant. Videos of his performances. Evidence of everything he'd been and everything he'd walked away from. As the sun came up, the decision was made. David would perform at the gala. The security guard would take the stage at the most important event of the year. David sat in the break room as everyone talked around him, making plans, calling people, spreading the news. He looked at his hands, these hands that had just betrayed 22 years of silence. These hands that had just changed everything. Part of him wanted to take it back. To say no, to stay invisible, to keep being nobody. That was safer. That didn't risk failure or judgment or the possibility that he couldn't live up to who he used to be. But another part of him, a part that had been buried for 22 years, was waking up. And it was terrified and excited and alive in a way he hadn't felt since Lisa died. He thought about what she would say if she could see him now. She'd probably laugh at how long it took him. She'd probably tell him what she always told him, that his gift wasn't his alone, that it was meant to be shared, that hiding it away helped nobody. David took a deep breath. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll do it." And just like that, the security guard who'd spent 3 years being invisible became the most visible person in the building. The next morning, David woke up in his small apartment wondering if it had all been a dream. But his phone was full of missed calls and text messages. It was real. He'd agreed to perform in front of 800 people in less than 3 weeks. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands. What had he done? By noon, the news had leaked. Someone on the board must have told someone who told someone else, and suddenly it was everywhere. Classical music blogs picked it up first. Forgotten pianist returns after 22 years, working as security guard. Then the mainstream news caught on. From guarding doors to playing for thousands, one man's remarkable comeback. David's old agent called. The man hadn't spoken to him in over 20 years, but now his voice was warm and friendly. "David, I always knew you'd come back. We should talk about representation. This comeback story, it's gold." David hung up on him. More calls came. Reporters wanting interviews. Other concert halls offering future performances. Recording companies interested in an album. Everyone suddenly wanted a piece of him. David turned off his phone and went to work. The concert hall had transformed the break room into a proper rehearsal space. The old piano was gone, replaced by a beautiful grand piano. Not as magnificent as the one on stage, but properly tuned and maintained. Richard had cleared David's schedule. No more security shifts until after the gala. His only job now was to practice, but David couldn't touch the piano that first day. He just stared at it. This was different from playing at 2 in the morning when nobody was watching. This was preparation for a real performance. Stakes, expectations, judgment. A younger pianist named Andrew, who sometimes performed at the hall, came to visit. "I heard what happened," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Pretty crazy story." "Yeah," David said. "You nervous?" "Terrified," Andrew smiled. "Good, that means you care. I heard you were incredible back in the day. Saw some old videos online last night. You really were something special." David felt a tightness in his chest. That was a long time ago. Maybe. But talent like that doesn't just disappear. Andrew paused. "Can I ask you something? Why'd you walk away? You were at the top. Most pianists would kill for the career you had." David was quiet for a moment. "I lost someone. And when she died, the music died too. Or at least that's what I thought." Andrew nodded slowly. "And now? Now I don't know what I think anymore." After Andrew left, David finally sat at the piano. He played through the Rachmaninoff piece, making notes of the difficult passages, the places where his technique wasn't quite what it used to be. His hands tired more quickly than they once did. His reach wasn't as flexible. 22 years had taken their toll. The next few days fell into a rhythm. David would arrive at the concert hall early, practice for hours, take a break, then practice more. His fingers began to remember their old strength. The calluses that had formed from manual labor slowly gave way to the different calluses of a pianist. But the physical preparation was only half the battle. The mental side was harder. Every time David closed his eyes to play, he saw Lisa. Every performance he'd ever given, she'd been there. In the audience, backstage, in his mind. She was woven into his relationship with music. Playing without her felt like learning to walk without legs. One evening, Richard came to check on his progress. The director had been different since that night. Quieter, more respectful. He knocked before entering, waited to be invited in. "How's it going?" Richard asked. David played a section of the concerto. His fingers stumbled over a particularly difficult passage. He cursed under his breath and stopped. "That sounded pretty good to me," Richard offered. "It's not good enough. That transition needs to be seamless. Right now it sounds like I'm thinking about it. It needs to be instinct." Richard sat down on one of the folding chairs. "Can I ask you something? That night when I made that stupid joke about firing anyone who played the piano, did you almost quit?" David considered lying, but decided against it. "I thought about it. I'm sorry. I say a lot of things without thinking. About the staff, about people I consider beneath me. I never saw you as a person, just as someone who worked here." Richard looked uncomfortable. "I was wrong. You weren't entirely wrong," David said. "I was trying to be invisible. I succeeded. Can't blame you for not seeing what I didn't want you to see. Still, I should have been better." Richard stood to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you're playing. Not just because it saves the gala, because I think you deserve another chance at this. Whatever your reasons were for walking away, they were valid. But maybe it's time to walk back." After Richard left, David sat alone with the piano. Walk back, like it was that simple. Like 22 years of grief and loss and deliberate forgetting could just be undone by playing one concert. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe it wasn't about undoing anything. Maybe it was about moving forward while carrying all that history with him. The criticism started about a week before the gala. A music blogger who'd followed David's career back in the day wrote a piece titled, "Can a Has-Been Make a Comeback?" It was brutal, pointing out that David was older now, out of practice, that the concert world had moved on. Why should anyone care about a pianist who'd abandoned his gift? Other critics piled on. Some defended him, saying everyone deserved a second chance. Others were skeptical. A few were cruel, suggesting it was a publicity stunt, that David probably wasn't any good anymore and the whole thing would be an embarrassment. David tried not to read the comments, but it was impossible. The doubt crept in. What if they were right? What if he got on that stage and failed? What if 22 years was too long and the gift really was gone? His practice sessions got worse. He'd make mistakes he never used to make. His timing would be off. The emotion that had flowed so naturally that first night now felt forced, artificial. 3 days before the gala, David had a complete breakdown. He was in the middle of the concerto when his hands just stopped. He sat there frozen, unable to continue. The notes on the page looked like a foreign language. His breathing got shallow. Panic attack. Andrew found him 20 minutes later still sitting at the piano, staring at nothing. "Hey, you okay?" David shook his head. "I can't do this. I thought I could, but I can't. I'm going to get on that stage and embarrass myself and everyone who believed in me." Andrew pulled up a chair. "You know what the difference is between you and most of the pianists performing today? They can actually play. They never lost anything. They've had smooth careers, steady progress, consistent success. But you've lived through hell. You know what it means to lose everything. That piece you're playing, Rachmaninoff wrote it when he was depressed, when he thought his career was over. He poured all that pain and struggle into the music. You understand that piece in a way most pianists never will. Understanding it and playing it are different things. Maybe, but I've heard you practice. When you stop thinking and just feel it, you're brilliant. The technique will be there when you need it. Trust yourself." That night, David went home and dug through boxes he hadn't opened in years. At the bottom of one, wrapped in an old t-shirt, he found a photograph. Lisa at one of his concerts, smiling at the camera. On the back she'd written, "You were born to do this." Don't ever forget, he'd forgotten. For 22 years he'd forgotten on purpose, because remembering hurt too much. David put the photograph in his wallet. The next morning he returned to the concert hall with something he hadn't had before. Not confidence exactly, but acceptance. He couldn't control whether people liked his performance. He couldn't control the critics or the doubt or the fear. All he could control was whether he showed up and gave everything he had. The remaining practice sessions were different. David stopped trying to be perfect. He stopped worrying about what people would think. He just played for himself, for Lisa, for everyone who'd ever felt lost and was trying to find their way back. Richard came by the evening before the gala. "You ready?" David thought about it honestly. "No, but I'm going to do it anyway." That's all anyone can ask. That night, David couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through the piece in his mind. His fingers moved against the blanket, practicing invisible notes. Tomorrow, the security guard who'd spent 3 years being nobody would step onto one of the most prestigious stages in the city. Everything he'd run from for 22 years was about to come back. And instead of being terrified, David felt something unexpected. He felt ready, not ready to be perfect. Not ready to prove anything to anyone, just ready to play. Ready to let the music that had been locked inside him finally breathe again. Ready to honor Lisa's memory not by hiding his gift but by sharing it. Tomorrow would be what it would be. But tonight, for the first time in 22 years, David felt like himself again. The night of the gala arrived with perfect clarity. No rain, no clouds, just a clear evening sky. David stood backstage in a borrowed tuxedo that didn't quite fit right. The sleeves were a bit long. He kept tugging at the collar. 22 years ago, he'd owned a dozen tuxedos, all tailored perfectly. Now he was wearing someone else's clothes, about to perform for people who had no idea what to expect. Through a gap in the curtain, he watched the audience arrive. Women in elegant gowns, men in expensive suits. The kind of people who attended galas like this regularly. They knew music. They'd heard the world's best performers. What would they think when a security guard walked onto the stage? David recognized some faces. Donors he'd checked tickets for. Board members who'd walked past him 1,000 times without really seeing him. Critics who'd written those harsh articles about has-beens and comebacks. His old agent was out there somewhere too, probably calculating how much money he could make if this went well. His hands were sweating. He wiped them on his pants and immediately regretted it. Borrowed tuxedo, be careful. His heart was beating so fast he wondered if anyone else could hear it. This was different from 22 years ago. Back then he'd been confident, established, expected to be brilliant. Now he was a question mark. A curiosity, a maybe. Richard appeared beside him, adjusting his own bow tie. The director looked nervous too, which somehow made David feel slightly better. Big crowd out there, Richard said. 800 seats, all filled. Standing room too. No pressure then. David managed a weak smile. Listen, I know I'm not good at this kind of thing, but... Richard paused, searching for words. What you did, taking this job, staying near music even when it hurt, that took courage. Tonight isn't about proving anything to those people out there. It's about you finishing something you started 22 years ago. On your terms this time. Before David could respond, the stage manager signaled, 5 minutes. David walked to the edge of the stage, still hidden by the curtain. He could hear the orchestra tuning, that beautiful chaos of instruments finding their pitches. The conductor, an older woman named Helen who'd been kind during rehearsals, gave him an encouraging nod. He touched the photograph in his pocket. Lisa's face, her handwriting. You were born to do this. The house lights dimmed. The audience settled into that expectant silence that comes before a performance. David took one last deep breath and walked onto the stage. The applause was polite, curious. He could feel 800 pairs of eyes on him, assessing, judging, wondering. An older man in a security guard's body, gray at the temples, hands showing his age. This was supposed to be their star performer. David sat at the grand piano. The stage lights were warm on his face. He adjusted the bench, taking his time. This piano was magnificent. Perfectly tuned, responsive, a completely different instrument from the old one in the break room. He placed his hands on the keys and the audience went completely silent. For a moment, nothing happened. David's mind went blank. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading. What if his hands froze? What if nothing came out? Then he heard Lisa's voice in his memory. From that first night she'd come to interview him. Why do you play? She'd asked. And he'd told her, because some feelings don't have words. Music is how I say the things I can't say any other way. David closed his eyes. The conductor raised her baton. The orchestra began the opening bars of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, and David's hands started to move. The first notes were tentative, soft, building slowly, carefully. This piece starts with simple chords that gradually grow more complex, like someone waking from a long sleep. David let himself sink into it. All the fear, all the doubt, all the people watching had faded away. There was only the music. His fingers found their rhythm. The technique came back, not because he'd practiced it to death, but because it had never really left. It had just been waiting, like everything else, for him to be ready. The piece moved into the famous melody, that sweeping, emotional theme that everyone recognizes. David played it with every ounce of feeling he had. Not showing off, not trying to prove anything. Just honest, raw, real. He thought about Lisa in the hospital holding his hand. He thought about the years of silence, of being invisible, of pretending he was someone else. He thought about that night in the break room when the music finally broke through. All of it poured into his playing. The audience disappeared. The concert hall disappeared. David was somewhere else entirely, a place where grief and beauty existed together, where loss and hope weren't opposites but partners in the same dance. The piano sang under his hands, telling a story that everyone in that room could feel even if they couldn't name it. The technical passages, the ones he'd struggled with in practice, flowed effortlessly now. His hands moved faster than his conscious mind, trusting muscle memory, trusting instinct. There were moments of incredible delicacy, barely touching the keys. Then moments of power, his whole body involved in creating sound. Sweat dripped down his face. His shoulders ached. His fingers moved across the keys in patterns he'd played thousands of times before, but somehow each note felt new, fresh, like he was discovering the piece for the first time. The orchestra swelled around him, supporting him, following his lead. The conductor had tears on her cheeks. David saw it during one of the quieter passages and felt something break open in his chest. Not pain this time, but release. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, David felt Lisa's presence so strongly it was like she was sitting right there beside him. Not sad anymore, not sick. Just there, the way she'd always been at his performances. Believing in him. Loving him. Letting him know it was okay to be alive, to make music, to keep going without her. The final chords came, triumphant, resolved, peaceful. David played them with everything he had left. His whole body, his whole heart, 22 years of silence breaking into sound. The last note rang out, sustained by the pedal, gradually fading into silence. For several seconds, nobody moved. That sacred space where great music lives before the world comes rushing back. David sat at the piano, hands still on the keys, breathing hard, barely able to believe what had just happened. Then the audience exploded. People leapt to their feet, shouting, applauding so loudly the sound was almost overwhelming. "Bravo!" someone yelled. Then others joined in. "Bravo, bravo!" David stood and bowed. The applause didn't stop. He bowed again. The orchestra stood and applauded him. The conductor was openly crying now, coming over to shake his hand. The audience kept clapping, some people wiping their eyes, others just standing there in stunned appreciation. He looked out at the crowd and saw Richard in the front row, clapping harder than anyone, a huge smile on his face. Saw his old agent looking shocked. Saw the critics who'd written those harsh articles now on their feet, applauding. Saw hundreds of strangers who'd come expecting one thing and received something entirely different. Backstage afterward, chaos erupted. People crowded around wanting to talk to him, congratulate him, offer opportunities, recording contracts, concert tours, teaching positions, magazine interviews. Everyone wanted a piece of the comeback story. David listened politely but didn't commit to anything. An orchestra member hugged him. Helen, the conductor, told him it was the most moving performance she'd conducted in 30 years. Andrew found him and just grinned. "Told you," was all he said. Richard pushed through the crowd. "I don't even know what to say." "It's okay," David said. "You don't have to say anything." But Richard shook his head. "I was wrong about everything. About you. About what matters. About who deserves to be seen." He paused. "You're not working security anymore. I mean, if you don't want to. You could teach here, perform, whatever you want." David smiled. "Actually, I think I'll keep the security job." "If that's all right." Richard looked confused. "Why would you want to keep working security when you could—" "Because I like the quiet," David said simply. "I like being around music without all the pressure. And maybe I'll perform sometimes, teach some students, do small concerts. But on my terms. Not because I have to prove something or rebuild a career, just because I love it." Later that night, after everyone left and the building emptied, David changed back into his security uniform. He did his usual rounds, checking doors, making sure everything was locked up. The grand piano still sat on the stage, lid closed, waiting for the next performance. He stopped in the break room where it all started. The new piano was there, the one they'd brought in for his rehearsals. David sat down and played quietly, just for himself. Nothing complicated, just a simple melody Lisa used to love. The notes floated through the empty building, soft and gentle. No audience, no pressure, no expectations. Just David and the piano and the music that had finally found its way home. He thought about everything that had happened. The loss, the silence, the years of hiding, the unexpected second chance. Life was strange that way. You never knew when something would break you open or when you'd be ready to let it. David finished playing and sat there in the quiet. He pulled out the photograph of Lisa, looked at her smile and whispered, "Thank you." Then he put it back in his pocket, turned off the lights, and continued his rounds. The security guard who'd played for 800 people. The invisible man who'd been seen. The artist who'd found his voice again. Not by going back to who he was, but by accepting who he'd become. And somehow, that was enough.